Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel Kalanati. Today I'm going to talk about 4 Ways to Forgiveness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a collection of 4 interlocking, intersecting stories about the planets Werel and Yeowe and the issues of slavery and freedom there. This collection is part of her Hainish cycle, and people from the Hainish ecumen do appear in the stories, but at the point at which these stories are written, both planets, Werel and its sister planet Yeowe, are not part of the ecumen, but they're kind of attempting to join, or they are hoping to join eventually, which is not possible until they completely abolish slavery. So I'm going to talk about each of these stories one by one. I think that's kind of the best way to talk about them. They don't always have very overt connections with each other, except that they're clearly about similar issues of what is freedom. There are different kinds of freedom, and they are different, and some of them are more free than others. But how do you know you are free? You know, and it tackles issues of bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy, and especially for women. I'll talk about that more at the last story. So the first story in here is called Betrayals, and it is about an old woman named Yeowe who lives out in the middle of nowhere, and she encounters a man named Abercam whom she knows. He was once a leader in the slave rebellion on Yeowe, and he fell from grace very disastrously. He was embezzled funds and lied, and he was using his people for his own end at a time when they needed him the most. And he is disgraced. He is basically in self-exile. So Yeowe encounters him and eventually nurses him back to health when he becomes very deathly ill. And I think this is the first moment when I started thinking about the title of this collection. It's 4 Ways to Forgiveness. So we have 4 stories. Are they all stories of forgiveness? I think that Betrayals is actually the one story where the aspect of forgiveness is the most obvious, in that Yeowe knows what Abercam did, and I would say through her actions she comes to forgive him for that, not because he ever explicitly asks her for forgiveness and she tells him that she does, but that she cares for him. She helps him live. This story is actually one that I had read before. I think it is included in a couple of other collections like The Unreal and the Real. So I think this is actually the 3rd time that I have read it. And I feel like it's one of those stories where I understand it so much better now that I'm an adult. There's some really deep things happening under the surface that I did not gather when I was younger, I think. But this is also the story I don't have as much to actually say about. I thought it was a good story. It's one of the shorter ones as well. The next story is Forgiveness Day, and it concerns 2 characters. Solly, who is an ambassador from the ecumen to Werel, and Yeowe, who is a pretty privileged man from the owner caste, who is part of the military and fought against the slave rebellion on Yeowe. And the story actually covers most of his life history about the family that he came from, his first marriage, how he became a member of the military, what happened to him when he was fighting, and then ultimately what happened when he came back to Werel, having lost the war, having survived when so many others didn't. And he's kind of not overtly ostracized, but all of a sudden his job, his position in society doesn't mean anything, and he has nothing to do. He is assigned as a bodyguard to Solly when she comes as an ambassador from the ecumen. And oh my goodness, Yeowe doesn't like her. I didn't like her in the beginning either. Compared to the other characters you've read about so far in this book, she is the wild child. She's spoiled and bratty, and she doesn't seem to have any respect for the traditions and the customs and the way of life. She sort of tramples all over society, and a lot of that judgment is that she is a woman behaving in a way that only men are allowed to. And I hate it that I kind of reacted in the same way to her like that as the Werelian men like Yeowe did. And so initially, Solly and Yeowe don't like each other. They don't understand each other. And then a disastrous thing happens. They have to see how strong the other person is. That the other person is actually a person, that there's more to them than just that initial impression. And that, you know, you peel away the mask and there is more there. I think this story struck me so much by the end because I disliked the two characters so much at the beginning. I thought Yeowe was kind of a misogynist, that he was way too stiff-necked, and that he had just sort of floated along in society and never really questioned or thought about some of the deeper issues going on, some of the deeper prejudices and social issues. And that he didn't even try to understand that Solly was an alien, that she was never going to behave the way that he thought women should behave. But I also really dislike Solly because of what I just said. She did not seem sensitive enough, you know? But by the end, they survive this event. They have to work together. They have to keep their dignity intact as well. And then there's such a solid bond between them. And I felt like they both grown up so much in that one event. What that has to do overall with the issues of slavery and freedom and the massive social changes happening on Werel and stuff is more that they end up where they are because of these things that are happening in society. They get pulled along, they get sucked into these things too. And they are major characters who can have an influence, who have authority and can actually do something later on. And I believe that Solly at least is mentioned in the next two stories. The third story is A Man of the People, and this is about Havjiva. He is a Hainish man. I don't remember exactly what planet he comes from. Havjiva comes from a Hainish society that is, it seems to have very strict rules and processes. You get to a certain age, you always do this. You go through these rituals. You can only marry people from these families. You can only have children in this way. You will only ever do this sort of work. And he doesn't fit into it very well. And he eventually goes off to study history at a university and works his way up to becoming another ambassador or representative of the Hainish people, of the Ecumen. And he goes to Yeowe. And when he arrives, the first thing that he does is he wants to take a walk in the city on his first day there, and all the men tell him, oh, you can't do that, it's too dangerous. And he goes, he walks out into the city to see the people, to see the world, and a gang of men set upon him because he is the alien, and they beat him up and he almost dies. And then he comes back again and again. He doesn't give up. This is the place where he wants to understand, that he wants to belong. These are his people, his adopted people. I felt like this story was so much about how there are different ways of living, and just because they're different doesn't mean that they are wrong. Just because you do things differently doesn't mean that there's a right way and a wrong way. And sometimes people don't fit into one society, they fit better in another. I really, really liked Havjiva. I think I really felt for him at the beginning and all the way through to the end. The things that he goes through is this gradual journey of him, I think, finding his spot. And yes, it is Yeowe, this planet that is so broken and fraught with problems of slavery and the mindset that slavery has ingrained on the people, even though that they are free. And here we start getting into, I think, the real issue of the women aren't free even if the men are. Because what Havjiva learns is that it's the female slaves who started the rebellion, but they are the ones who lost the most. Because women, no matter what their caste, no matter if they are female owners or female slaves, they are still second-class citizens. So the women who are former slaves are still treated as if they are slaves by the men. And Havjiva wants to do something about that, but he cannot directly interfere. The ecumen is not there to fix everything. It's not there to change the laws and to lift the people up. They're there mainly as observers, but their representatives do have some cachet, some political clout, some authority. Their opinions matter in important ways. So Havjiva is able to do these small things that seem kind of symbolic, like he requests that all of his bodyguards be women. So he does these small things that really build up over time. He is definitely an active member of like the feminist movement in this society. And I really enjoyed that. I liked how it showed that anyone, and especially men, can participate, they can help without doing what I think is called like white knighting, taking over, taking control and running the movement themselves. He's working with the women. Then there is the last story. This is called A Woman's Liberation, and I'm pretty sure this is the longest one in the story. I think it's about 100 pages long. And this is the life story of a woman named Rakam, who was born into slavery on Werel, the home planet, and eventually ends up on Yeowe after the rebellion has succeeded. This is probably the most difficult story to read because of the content. Like, I would put trigger warnings on this entire collection for rape and sexual assault and physical abuse. Just horrific things happen. And Rakam's story encapsulates all of that. All of this has happened to her. She has lived her entire life in this transition from the horrors of slavery to eventually realizing what it is to be a genuinely free person and a genuinely free woman, and all this stuff that happened to her before that was possible. So I won't describe everything that happens in this, but it is really difficult, especially the beginning parts when she is young. She's sexually groomed by her owner's wife, and then she is essentially relegated to become a sex slave. She is raped, she's abused, and then eventually manages to gain some form of freedom on Werel, but then has to be smuggled off the planet to escape being enslaved again. But when she lands in Yeowe, even though they've just achieved their freedom, she's a woman, and with a whole group of other women, she's relegated to being a slave for the men again, and then has to, you know, claw her way back up because she is actually quite educated and wants to be a teacher, wants to be a leader and an educator. And part of that struggle with her and her identity and realizing she's free is in how she practices her sexual freedom, her sexual liberation. So in a way, she practices her freedom by eventually not having sex with anyone and repelling the advances of other people, in that she's just not going to ever be that physically intimate with somebody again until it's love, until she can do it rather than having it done to her. It was incredibly powerful, and while I felt in the beginning of the story that I was just kind of repulsed, I wanted to get through it, I just found it so difficult to read the descriptions of these things happening. It's not glorified violence, it's not on the page to shock you, but it's on the page to tell you this is what it is really like. And in the way that it's written, it's almost a sort of flat, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's almost kind of emotionless. And then maybe makes it a bit easier to read, but it's horrific because the reason I think it comes across as emotionless is because what Rakam says, when this was happening to me, I didn't know it was a bad thing. I was not horrified at the time because I thought this was just the way that life was. And it didn't become horrible. It didn't become a scarring thing until later when she was free, when she had that freedom of choice and realized she didn't have it before. And then it became easier to read as she really grows into herself and good things start happening. I don't think this is exactly a spoiler. I want to mention it because it's one of those things that just really lifted my spirits when it actually happened. But Rakam eventually meets Havjiva from the previous story, and it was so good to see him again, but also they have a connection. They are meant for each other. It's like something so good and so loving caps off the entire collection. It was really emotional, and I'm getting emotional talking about it now, and I'm not exactly sure why. I have have read other books by Le Guin that grapple with issues of slavery, and the one that comes to mind immediately compared to this is Powers, which, like the stories here, really kind of interrogates that question of what slavery does, not just to the slaves, but also to the owners, to the masters. And that's an element I want to point out in these stories, in this collection as well, is that what Le Guin, I think, is portraying is that slavery is an institution that begins to perpetuate itself, and it not only enslaves the minds of the people that are the actual slaves, it also enslaves the minds of the people who are in power. It becomes this self-perpetuating machine that is hard for anyone to break out of, even if they apparently have the power or the authority to do so. That's what it does to you. It destroys you from the inside out, and there are often no good answers, no good ways of ending it, you know? It takes a long time, and that's why I think these stories span entire lifetimes, decades and decades of hard work and a lot of repetitive work, because you go a couple steps forward and then you fall back. You go a couple steps forward and then you fall back again. It takes a long time. So overall, this was incredibly powerful. It has some parts that are more difficult to read. That will vary for the reader, I think, but for me it was challenging. And I absolutely loved it. It's written so well. It's so beautiful, and I wish that I'd had more sticky notes. I ran out of sticky notes because I would have marked so many passages and good quotes from this, because Le Guin she drops those pearls of wisdom everywhere. So I think I'm done talking about this. Let me know if you have read this or any of the other books on similar themes that Le Guin has written, and what you thought about them. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will talk to you again soon. And until then, bye.